the Monday night lecture series, College of Architecture and Planning at Ball State. It's unfortunate that we have maybe tremendous competition tonight with the Cuban volleyball team, as all of you know, being present, and Robert Merrill. Our speaker tonight is an architect, a naval architect, a planner, educator, traveler, and an educator, I think, of outstanding excellence. He grew up in Illinois. He attended the University of Illinois, where he graduated with highest honors when he received his Bachelor's of Architecture degree in 1939, or 36. He received also the AIA Medal, the first Ricker Prize awarded by the University of Illinois, also the Allerton Traveling Fellowship. Later he went on to do graduate study at MIT, where he received his master's degree in 1939 and received numerous awards as a result of his contribution as a student at that institution. He then went to, at that time, Oklahoma A&M, better known as Oklahoma State University now, where he taught as an instructor. Then from 1942 to 1946, he served in the U.S. Navy in the South Pacific. Dick already had a very strong interest in naval architecture long before serving as a commissioned officer. He was appointed assistant professor of architecture at the University of Illinois in 1946. By 1951, he had moved up to the rank of full professor, which was almost unheard of at that time and at that institution. I first met him at about that time, fortunately, as a student of his in studio. It was also at about that time that we developed a friendship, relationship in practice. Dick was a design consultant and really the chief designer of the architectural firm of Lundin and Hilfinger in Bloomington, Illinois. And Dick won numerous awards for his outstanding designs and contribution in the field of architectural education. He decided to retire early from teaching at the University of Illinois and retired in 1970, took emeritus status. The following year, he was made a fellow in the American Institute of Architects. Well, the list of his accomplishments, one could go on and spend another 10 or 15 minutes covering them. His latest interest is, I think, manifold, a book that he is writing as a result of receiving a grant from the Graham Foundation in 1973, the Urban Stage, and also continues to be extremely active as an educator, visiting critic at numerous schools in the United States, and continues to practice architecture. It's a real pleasure to present A. Richard Williams. Dick?
Thank you, Dave. Yeah. I hope I won't be repeating too much for those of you who were here this afternoon to go with me through a voyage of introspection about architecture and about design of boats, and with some reference to the title that Dave has told you about, the current work that I'm about to be ready for publication on the Urban Stage. But in case you were here this afternoon, please bear with me. I'll try not to repeat too much. But I did want to present this afternoon some examples of work in which the principles that have been developing over many years now may may have found some expression. I'll do that again this evening with some different examples, a little different frame of reference. First, to begin with, I would like to make a few remarks about the current state of architectural education and architectural literature. I think we're all fairly well informed of the current scene, to the point of saying, well, what maybe is our direction? Where are we going in practice and in education? What hopeful new signs can we find? And it's very hard, of course, to be sure of any single direction, nor should there be one. I'm sure all of us would find it difficult to argue that there is one future path for the profession, for environmental design, the larger context, or for our whole approach to human progress. But there are, I think, some signs that can be pointed to. I, for one, am a liberal, a humanist, a romantic. I guess part of that is attributed to being so fortunate in having, and I didn't choose my parents. I guess that's the law of nature, but I was very lucky to have parents who are very, very interested in literature and in the theater, and very active in theater in their younger years. And I kind of grew up with that romantic tradition of quoting from various plays and poems and Shakespeare and so on. So as I was probing through the various body of work that I as an individual have been fortunate to be able to do, as well as collaborative work with our graduate students at Illinois and with our collaborative studios with landscape and planning, over quite a number of years, there seemed to be maybe a fairly personal direction developing, which seemed to follow what many of our sociologist friends are increasingly describing as the dramatic metaphor, or the following the thoughts of Max Weber and Kenneth Burke and Hugh Duncan and others more recently, who say, looked at life as if it is theater, but don't believe it necessarily. Just what can we learn by considering all the world a stage and all the men and women players, to quote from As You Like It. We can learn a lot. I'm going to try to point that out, but before going into that thesis and trying to relate architecture to it, I'd like to subject you to a few of the where are we now, what are our values kind of slides, and very few. I mean, I'm sure you've seen this before. Roughly described, they can be our concern about social justice or injustice, and our recognition of environmental justice, perhaps. There's the world of man and the world of nature that concerns us. We want to find some better equilibrium for our own present and our future. We're very much concerned with the changes in values that are or are not taking place. And from this very large context, we're trying to find some new direction. I think my feeling is that we as architects, I said this afternoon, I am here to testify to one and all that after a good part of a lifetime, I still think it's the greatest thing anyone can do. It's been a grand experience. I just heard this morning a short excerpt about Rosalind Russell's, the new book about her life called Life as a Banquet. I think it's an especially rich banquet if architecture is your métier. Now, so I'm going to try to relate our particular position, professional position, to value change, and then bring it down to the more specific consideration of architectural theory from the point of view of the dramatic metaphor. Here, I guess you recognize the urban scene. Indianapolis, dear old Indy on the left. I don't know whether that tank is still there in the foreground of Riley Center, but that is Indianapolis. What are our urban values? And where do we stand? We hear from all sides that we're at a crossroads, and perhaps this is characteristic of any age in history, to consider the time is ripe, it's a time of crisis, and that may be as a consistent attribute of any time or place. But Jay Forrester at MIT and certain others have been looking at various curves. On the right, I don't think you can see that very clearly, whether all the lettering is clear or not, but there's an attempt there to relate measurable physical changes, which aren't really given any values, but questions of resource use, resource depletion, pollution, population growth, how they tend to interact, and what might affect them, what might be a cause in affecting their change. Here I call it the socio-environmental ethic. If you remember those two first slides, one representing social values, the other perhaps environmental values, they combine to form one picture of an ethical change. That thick line sloping up in the S-curve is very optimistic. It's a very optimistic view of the future. Some call it new consciousness, the post-industrial society, age of compassion, and so on. But there is a sense of an inflection point where our conscience is becoming, not that it makes cowards of us all, but it may make us a little more brave to face the future. I think this is a very significant curve for our future as architects, because if it is true, if we can indeed find all of our fellow men becoming more conscious of a socio-environmental ethic, then our services to a much wider spectrum of our fellow men will be understood better. I think it's very difficult to, as a member of AIA, or if you're working, trying to propagandize the quality of life, how it can be improved through architecture. Who is an architect? What does an architect do? Unless this kind of value change begins to take place. And this is speculation and hopeful. I mean, it's very optimistic, as I said, but if we assume there may be value change coming, and we can recognize it and aid it and abet it politically and every other way in terms of education, we have a tremendous future. One way of saying this is perhaps not the literal one of recognition of landscape as it long deserved to be recognized. Not only that, the greening of America, as Charles Reich describes it in his book, is a greening of spirit. And you can play games with whether it means more, that awful term, growies, or not. But I thought it was interesting. This slide on the left is the entrance to the Empress Hotel in Victoria, BC, British Columbia. You come in to the hotel through a greenhouse. What a great idea as an entrance vestibule. I think Dean Sappenfield has it in his house. If you put a few more plants in that vestibule, Charlie, you'll have a conservatory entrance. It's I think a wonderful way to integrate the world of man, the world of nature. So this is, I believe, one direction. However, I want to bring it down to the thesis of the book, or whatever you might want to call it, just an assembly of ideas, and try to see this as one part of the spectrum of change, how we might view architecture and urban design from the point of view of the dramatic metaphor. I wouldn't mean this would exclude any considerations of planning and landscape and our sister design professions. I want to try to show how that can be a part of it. If we look at the right-hand slide, the chapter titles were an attempt to extend the idea of the metaphor, which I'm sure you are familiar with by now through reading with Shakespeare and maybe the work of some sociologists. I found that in Hamlet, there were three enticing phrases which Ophelia uses in her soliloquy in describing Hamlet's character. She describes him as the glass of fashion, the mold of form, the observed of all observers. I thought, well, let's think of that as Hamlet's nobility of character as the personification of architecture. I feel architecture, it has the potential at every level of scale, from the most modest to the most sublime, to be noble and to add to the nobility of mankind. So Shakespeare, in using these three phrases to describe Hamlet's character, the glass of fashion, the mold of form, the observed of all observers, I thought those three titles might be appropriate in considering architecture and the qualities of it that may be emphasized perhaps a little more than they have been. I discussed the glass of fashion this afternoon. That is an attempt to explore what is more substantial about understanding the fashion of a time, more substantial than the superficial attributes of appearance, dress, architectural style, and so on. And I want to go into that in a minute, but first to describe the other chapter titles. The mold of form is perhaps obvious. How do we put buildings together? How do we look at patterns of human behavior that may be then translated into program, then translated into real space, how they can be furnished, and so on. That's fairly normal theory. Observed of all observers is an essay on criticism, which maybe some of you might have read last year in the AIA's MAGA paper. The student chapters published that chapter. It's an attempt particularly to look at the qualities of self-criticism. I think we hear a lot, we read a lot of theory of criticism, but so often I think we externalize it. We don't look at our own capacity. It's very important, I think, for architects to be aware of a developing ability to criticize one's own work. And that's an effort to do that. The Signs of Takamatsu is a diversion, which right at the end I may read that to you. It's a very short prose poem which tries to consider total urban form as if it's a theatrical setting, that is, the whole city as a stage, not just the parts of it. The artist of environment is a plea that once presuming the optimistic rise of that curve I showed you, that we do reach a level of better equilibrium in resource use and population balance, and through the benefit of environmental scientists, what can the artist contribute after that or during that process? You hear the phrase, well, once the ecological balance, once our resources are in better balance, we will approach normal existence. What is normal? And after things are normal, what then? To whom do we turn for enhancement of what might be still more alluring, more exciting? And this doesn't mean luxury at all. It may be a better understanding of very simple things. So the philosophy of the artist of environment is hopefully an extension of our present definition of architecture, landscape architecture, industrial design, interior design, all the design professions. How would we relate to a future age of enlightenment in which a concept of environmental art is possible? Now, of course, this is a subjective view, but it was a chance to do that. Cadre de vie, the last chapter, is a phrase that means life-setting frame of life, but it implies, in the French idiom, it implies a sense of the ensemble, that is, not just the parts taken separately, but how all parts of a setting become tunable as a unit. If we're doing a kitchen, or we're doing a house entirely, or a music room, or any kind of space that has as its total setting aspects of setting, aspects of properties, and use of the other media of sound, and thermal, olfactory, tactile media. How does that all come together? I'm going to try to show you examples of that, but coming at the end, it's a plea really for a better public education. But I'm sure we're all familiar with the present trends, and I think there's some of them are encouraging in environmental education in primary and secondary schools. There is an increasing recognition of the need to bring to the attention of children, of everybody, as they are growing up, the importance of choice making, of making related sets of choices, so that we can furnish for ourselves a better setting for our lives. So that's just a capsule outline of the content, and I hope that some of these will become more clear as we go through the progression of slides. A few more diagrams, and just if you'll be patient, I hope I won't go too far out with some of this theory, because before I bring it back to some examples. Well, one of the concepts that I think we would understand as architects and landscape architects, planners, anyone dealing with physical space and activities that take place within that space, is to look at all kinds of human settings in terms of a backstage, front stage relationship. I think we're all familiar with this. We have performing areas in which our daily lives are acted out, and we have support areas. This is an oversimplification, but as you work with the design of space, I think you certainly become aware of many aspects of this interrelationship of on-stage, off-stage spaces, and how they may be reinforced and handled in different ways. There's some very good examples in history and today, of course. Celebration of the Mass is, I think, an excellent one if you consider Chartres Cathedral, for example, or even a much more modest example of chapel or church in which the front stage area is the sanctuary and the nave acting together, interacting, supported by sacristies, supported by auxiliary ancillary spaces. Now, between those two, I think this is something, as we go through various slides, I hope we can look more closely at thresholds. That's the points of change and inflection between on-stage and off-stage settings. I'll try to point some of them out and what maybe some of the significant aspects, design aspects may be. On the right-hand side is an attempt to portray the interaction of setting, the props within the setting, and performance. The theory being, as I explained this afternoon, that if we are to understand the qualities of architecture or any of the design activity, design professions, we should not think only of their static qualities, but their qualities as they are unfolded through performance and perceived through performance. The interaction of the setting and the performance. So that diagram with time, where you ever see this on diagrams, time is always left to right. That's just a convention. The timeline is moving. And in the upper part of that diagram, you see the semicircle indicating the setting. It's not a Bucky Fuller dome, or don't take it literally. It's just an indication of an enclosure. It could be a room, could be a part of a living room, a coffee table area where conversations takes place. Could be a kitchen, could be a studio, could be a lecture room. Any one of those kinds of spaces. It could be a large public square. Well, within that, there are various pieces of equipment, of gear, of properties, to use the stage term. The wiggly line going in is a portrayal of a performance. It could be any kind of performance. The idea is that the design of the setting, the arrangement of properties are constantly interacting with that performance, and at some point they may be very crucial, where the tuning of the properties and the setting itself is so critical that the performance is affected. Now, I'll try to show some examples of that as we go ahead. The lower part of that diagram indicates some, in an oversimplified way, some picture of kinds of everyday life performances and some that are longer duration that would have various levels of activity in which the setting would interact. This is not just an invention of mine, although the diagrams are original. Many behavioral scientists have been pointing out the importance of understanding the influence of the environment on behavior and vice versa. And so there's nothing new. It's just, I'm just trying to make a bridge between what is being investigated more and more research, behavioral science, and the way I would see it as sort of a senior citizen practitioner. A lot of what I'm trying to present to you is theory derived from practice rather than theory derived from theory, if I can make that kind of a statement. So there may be flaws in it, but I'm just trying to get at the core idea and understanding of how we can appreciate the dynamics of performance and a setting intertwined. Now, a further extension of that would be to see sequences of similar performances and how they can be improved. And, the diagram on the left is an attempt to portray what may come from a given interaction that is observed and becomes a part of our experience in our knowledge bank. And then in the recycle of that same performance, there is an improvement, or a potential improvement. This could apply to a series of design studies in the studio, where you do a first study, then a refinement, and so on. It's again an interaction thing. The same thing is portrayed on the right-hand diagram, a series of interactions of performances and settings. It could be somebody's kitchen, and when they're gradually getting better as a cook. And they get more aware of how they can improve the setting and whatever's in it. The 12-meter yacht is an example of intense refinement and intertwining of the design of the boat, the sail plan, the tuning, the trim, the crew practice, and so on. Through repeated performances, there's some kind of peak that's reached. And at such a peak, there's again an influence. I think we see this all over the place in the work of the more outstanding architects of our time and in history. That you could consider the work of Palladio, the best work maybe, as somewhere at the upper end of that, where there's been such significant recognition of quality that the influence then goes way beyond the given cycle that we're talking about. Okay, now for a few examples. There could be many, many, many more, and I don't mean to suggest these are the only ones. I think the Japanese tea ceremony is an excellent one of intertwining of performance and setting, utensils, their form and the motion in which they become part of the ceremony. The setting itself is so inextricably related to the action. Also, if you read any description of tea ceremony, history and art of Bradley, I think, has a nice description of that, in which I don't know, some Japanese tea master is reported as bringing up each of the 5 senses that are involved. So we not only have the close interaction of the setting and its utensils and the ceremony itself, but all the senses are involved: sound, smell, tactile response, and so on. So it's very, very much. I think another good example of that is Holy Communion at Ronchamp, Corbusier's chapel in France. I happened to be there during Mass and participated with the communicants in Holy Communion, and it was an extremely moving experience. I think what we have tended to appreciate about the work of Corbusier and other great architects, Kahn and Frank Lloyd Wright and others, is so often static. I mean, we don't really think of their work as something in which is enriching to an activity that was designed to take place there. Now, communion in Ronchamp was a tremendous moving experience to me, more so than almost any other time, because here you see the rail. You see it very well or not, but it's kind of a wood rail. You kneel down there, and I happened to be close to that candelabra, so close to it that I smelled the wax and felt the heat from the candles. And the sound of there's just something about the quality of the sound that was a part of that too. And then just at the right was that deepest stained glass window, which I think is symbolic of a hearth. I don't know, but it was close. So there was an absolutely intertwining of all the senses in that performance, in that setting. Well, let's carry that just a little further and look at some of the kinds of settings that we deal with every day. Probably the most fundamental, I have a couple of more diagrams to show that I think will carry this a little further. But the most fundamental human setting, I believe, is that of dialogue. Dialogue that takes place around a place of food, sharing of food, a dining table. And this, in Jerry Exline's drawings, at the right, there's, maybe it's a card game in this case, and a courtyard, in which there's a kind of a focusing on an intimate scale of human interaction. On the left is just some tables in the Boboli Garden in Florence from a Belvedere at one of the corners of the gardens there. And you see this same kind of pattern of human relationship around a table. A table in this context, I think, becomes a very rich thing, a very important, probably the most important single kind of art property with which we deal. I want to come back to that and show the expansion of this kind of a setting as it enlarges to become a part of urban design. I was fortunate some 8 or 10 years ago to design the adaptive reuse of a nice old building on the house on the Urbana campus for the Center for Advanced Study there, which here you see, there's nothing very elaborate about it, just recognition, tried to recognize what was there, and add a few Thonet chairs, and provide a setting for dialogue. And this was the intention of this modest building, to be a place where postdoctoral students, there's some younger, some older, would come and discuss from all kinds of disciplines. At this table there's Don Wang and Chuck Rush, who's now at UCLA, David Pines on the upper right, one of the world's eminent physicists. There's a vending machine lunch arrangement there. So it's a very modest thing, but I felt that it was an example of this kind of human setting. Or we can expand the scale slightly. On the right is Bastion Square in Victoria, BC, which I like very much because it is a pedestrian space and all the buildings around it are older buildings and they've been brought together. A centralizing artifact, the top of a lighthouse, gives it its nautical flavor. Naturally, I like that since I'm a boat freak. And it's simply a larger scale version of a meeting place, a place where people come together. On the left is Leb Wood's drawing of Dearborn Square in Kankakee, which is now built. I should have brought one of the slides of the finished product. It's a little different from our design, but basically the same idea. It's a closed street that formed a small plaza, and we made every effort to persuade the people, and they did it, to put a good restaurant there. Not just a restaurant, but a good one. So this idea of food and drink being available as the center of socialization was very fundamental in the proposal. Here are a couple of projects as yet unbuilt. On the right is Champagne Circle. I don't know if you know Champaign-Urbana. Urbana has remodeled its downtown already, and Victor Gruen came in and put in what's called Lincoln Square. So some of our clients felt, well, let's have Champagne Circle. And that was our version of a central space, a restaurant and bar, and surrounded by some other kinds of high activity uses in the center of a pedestrian area. Well, we didn't get it built that way. It's built, but it's a bottom dollar version of a space that isn't enclosed, and so it didn't come out that way. On the left is one of Jerry's sketches of our proposal for Chicago Heights, its downtown area, and that is coming out a little differently. But I think one thing we're trying as examples of urban design practice where you're working with a multiple client group. You're not working with a single client. You have many, many different interested constituents that you're trying to work with. That in presenting ideas, design proposals to them, it seemed to be more successful if we would use this kind of semi-precise line drawing. The reaction was much better for this in this kind of presentation than it was for very highly definitive models or very elaborate tempera renderings, opaque watercolor and so on. They were impressive. Of course, single clients seem to like the elaborate presentations, but the multiple client say, well, this is fine as a sketch. They don't accept it quite as literally. So that's why this technique was used. It's a little aside. Columbus, Indiana, about 12 years ago, one of our graduate teams, collaboration, landscape architecture and planning, took on downtown Columbus, and we proposed this 4th Street Mall. And it's very interesting that this study, at least the Columbus people keep telling us it was an influence, what was finally done with the courthouse center there with Caesar Pelle's design was this same idea of a passage through the river, to the river, was carried out as a part of the Sears and I don't know what the other shops are along into the courthouse center as an enclosed thing. But it's the same thing in scheme. But again, we were interested in how can we achieve an intimate human scale for a pedestrian area instead of, say, just closing a street with its 66-foot right-of-way, whatever it is, recognize that a pedestrian space is much more effective if it is more intimate. We had a proposal that doesn't really show too well in the model photograph to take Washington Street in Columbus and use the right-of-way, lease space within it so that merchants and owners on each side could invade that space, build within it, lease space, so that we could narrow and make more intimate the pedestrian area. And they could gain some revenue from that. 66 feet was just too wide. That hasn't been done, of course. Now, back to another aspect of the design process. I've been trying so far just to present a few examples of performance setting interaction and how they're maybe one thing instead of separate things, and how that extends through different levels of scale from the most intimate setting around a table to a more gregarious setting in cities, pedestrian areas, and so on. Now, I'd like to come back to design process theory a little bit because I don't want to go into the full flow of the diagram. I think we've all had maybe too much of that already. How you follow through the various steps in preparation, action, and reaction in any given design act or set of acts. What I'm really most interested in, and we'll try to point out as we finish this last group of slides, what maybe are the most crucial points in this flow. All of us who are old pros as designers and architects I think most everybody is very respectful of what we've gained in studying programming and design method theory and so on. But we also observe that somehow it becomes an excuse for delay of making that decision, making that commitment to a concept, making that critical step of this is what it amounts to, and developing it. So what I'm trying in this case to pinpoint some of those parts of this process where the design decision-making act is most acute, and where we see it extending. On the right-hand side, you see that series of circles which keeps flowing again from left to right, and I don't know whether you can read it or not, but the parts that I want to look at most closely as relevant to concept formation. The use, once you have information, you have the best analysis you can make of the program, and you're in the throes of trying to find the right kind of solution. I think that is the crucial thing I want to examine. I call it the search for essence, the search for an essential idea, and how maybe some aspects of that have been neglected in our education. The one I feel is most neglected, I've been talking about today quite a bit, is our literary background. Some of you may have heard of the synectic method of conceptualization, where analogies from other sources, usually scientific analogies, are applied to problem solving. Now that, generally, when you read anything about synectics, the use of analogy is the use of an analogy from a physical situation. The way maybe the structure of a radiolaria relates to three-dimensional space frames. That kind of a physical analogy is the kind we hear about very directly. What I'd like to probe instead is the use of literary analogy and metaphor as a very important and crucial conceptual understanding as a basis for design. There'll be some examples of that. So what I'm trying to do here is to come in on just a few of those circles, or only two: search for essence and the use of analogy and metaphor. And make apologies because that's, just a tiny bit of the whole thing, but I think it's an important thing. The other diagram is an attempt, and this comes from the chapter, The Observed of All Observers, is to try to understand better the interaction of experience and knowledge through project development. That arrow, that big arrow, is an attempt to portray the flow of one's own experience. The lower line of it, mainstream, which is this recycling and the repetition of what you see on the right-hand side, that right-hand diagram, many times. And from that repetition, again, it's somewhat the same idea as the improvement of a performance setting interaction. You begin to extract or distill principles, which we call the metastream, or it's a kind of overlying line upon which we would try to make other judgments that we can value as that procedure goes forward. And I think this is very critical in what I call critical judgment development. And why, it's the reason why I find us woefully, this is a very humble expression, I really believe we are woefully illiterate, not just a little bit. We talk about improving a curriculum by adding a year of liberal arts. That is so far short. I think it's not just liberal arts, it's experience and a curiosity about life and about intellectual growth that can so enrich one's critical capacity, and therefore one's ability to make good design decisions, I believe. Well, I promised you I wouldn't throw so many diagrams, but I think this is about the end of them. Here's an attempt to portray two kinds of search for essence in a given project. And there isn't too much difference in them, except the one on the right is subjective, and that's one I want to go into a little bit more. The one on the left is a search for essence in which the process of oscillation is constant. What the diagram means is that from our outer ring of knowledge and experience, we bring in each case, each new design task, some further understanding of not only that program, but how it relates to, on the top half of the diagram, to the metastream, which I showed in as if it's a cross-section of that one, finally leading to the very center, where we try to find a concept that reflects the essence of the idea. And I'm going to use examples for this. Now that is a generalization, and on the right-hand side, that same process becomes more subjective. How are we inspired? What does each new sequence of experiences mean in our own personal growth and development? How do we increase our ability to find the essential ingredients, what Louis Kahn and Paul Tillich calls the existence will of a given project, what it wants to be? That phrase, ontological influences, really means how can you find the essence of what that given set of conditions, site, program, client's needs, personality, and so on, is telling you about its own being, that you as the architect, the designer, can interact with. Well, in the search for essence, I like to divide it up into several parts, and say sometimes we will find it in a spatial idea. Sometimes we'll find it in a structural idea, sometimes a combination of these. So I was talking with Dave a little earlier about what I think is very important for history, and I'm sure you're getting this. Study of history is not only knowledge, a study of human knowledge as it's built into our cultural inheritance, but it also is a tremendous design laboratory where we can see what design concepts might be, as if we are contemporary designers. And when we look at Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri in Egypt, we can't understand it as they understood it, I'm sure, but at least we can appreciate some principles. That here was an exciting spatial idea. The architect of this temple recognized in this dramatic site that it would be ridiculous for him to build, or for the queen to build, a typical mortuary temple, pylon court, finally ending in the sanctuary. There, also, in this same setting, a little further away, there are such temples, and they are lost again in this site. For the flat areas of Egypt, it was fine to build pylons and courts, Temple of Karnak, Luxor, Medinet Abu, and so on. But in this site, there was enough imagination, there was enough recognition that the spatial idea, that the same thing might be accomplished, the same sequence of moving from the first space, that is the first terrace, by means of a ramp up to the next terrace, reducing the scale, finally into the rock-cut cliff itself. And this, I think the essence of this design is spatial. There's one of my favorites, the Campidoglio in Rome, is, I think, a magnificent example of the urban stage, and also of the essence of the design is a spatial design. It's interesting that the two facades, I'm sure you've studied this already, the flanking facades that Michelangelo designed are not parallel. They're not exactly parallel. They're closer together. I don't have the plan of this in this sequence, but they're closer together as you come up from the lower level of the Capitoline Hill and up and into this plaza. The statue of Marcus Aurelius it would appear to be at the geometric center, but it isn't. This slide on the left-hand side is what I think is the main focal space, where all the flow of the various lines of access and levels do intersect. It's an extremely dramatic space. The idea is this is where one would find space as the essential design feature. An example of structure might be, as essence, would be the Crystal Palace in London. I'm sure there are many examples you can think of. But part of the conceptualization of what the essential idea is certainly comes from this wealth of knowledge of our culture. We're literate about it. When I was asked to design the Second Appellate Court in Elgin, see the plan on the left, it happened just after I had returned from Galway, Ireland, where I had been a delegate to the Liturgical Arts Society at Pax Romana Congress in Galway. And I traveled with an architect friend. His name was Shaughnessy. And part of the time we were there, we were searching for the Shaughnessy Castle, which was in the vicinity of Galway. And we found it. And there it is, the plan of Galway Castle on the right. Of Shaughnessy Castle. You note there's the outer enclosure called the Outer Bailey, and the inner part of the central space is the Inner Bailey. And you'll notice that it's a central space, a room surrounded by a thick wall in which there are rooms. So you have three levels of space in that castle design, which is a typical Norman castle that had come over to Ireland. There are many, many of them. Well, when I got to the program of the Appellate Court, I noticed there was one courtroom that was served. Here's a front stage space served by many backstage spaces. And the memory of Shaughnessy Castle came up, What is there about it that's so very attractive? It was not only this idea of a central room surrounded by a thick wall in which there are other service rooms, and then again surrounded by another wall which had its function as a filter to all the rest of the world, so to speak. There were several neat things that I thought were analogous. The appellate court, as you know, in law, is a more discrete part of the process. Cases are tried in civil courts, and then they may be appealed, and they come to they may be appealed to an appellate court, which is really an examination of the quality of the legal process. Therefore, it's not public, it's more discreet. The site was already determined in the Elgin Civic Center. You see the lower diagram here. So it couldn't be, the appellate court in this case could not be hidden anywhere. It was very important. It's important symbolically, and yet functionally, it would be more restrained. So I thought that idea of the outer bailey, that is a wall, would be important. Then it became even more intriguing when I realized that American law was so directly influenced by English law, and that the foundation of English law that was practiced was Old Bailey in London, which was in truth an Inner Bailey. And this goes back in many other cultures in which judicial decisions were made in such spaces by maybe